Nia said, my name is Catherine Ricketts. I don't know if I can't decide where I want to be. This is a little different for me to have such a giant screen behind me. So anyway, I have been in the Florida Panhandle this time around for about 12 years. And so what I'm going to share with you tonight is some work that I was more directly involved with when I worked for FWC, and then kind of what's going on and what has gone on at the place I work now, which is at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines, owned by the Nature Conservancy. Um, so this is my tale of two communities, restoring Sandhill and Wet Prairie. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the work that's been done on each of these landscapes. And the Wet Prairie will have a bit more specifics because it's just referring to like one 70-acre tract compared to the Sandhill, which is going to be a more general description of what's gone on at the preserve and how TNC staff and partners have worked over the years to try to get a better understanding of how to bring back Sandhill ecosystems. Let's see. Oh. Do I have to? Maybe I'll just use this arrow. Like this arrow? Yeah, I did that. Sorry. Okay, but my botanical non sequitur, right? Here. So I don't know about you guys, but I kind of develop a nostalgia for plants. And this plant happened to be one of the first ones that I worked with officially as a job. Clearly not really relevant to the Sandhill or the Wet Prairie. This is heartleaf wild ginger. And I worked with this in the Piedmont of Georgia and southern North Carolina. So, however, I did happen to see it again on the Garden of Eden Trail. So it was kind of like a full circle moment for me. And anytime I see a picture of it, it just brings back that ginger scented leaf. And I don't know, I really like it. So this is kind of the start of things for me, involving jobs that were just plants, jobs that involved work with just birds, and not so much habitat. Then I found some jobs that combined both birds and plants and habitat, all three, I guess, really. But it wasn't until I got to FWC and started work as a biologist in the WMA system, which is in the wildlife and habitat management section, that I really started to understand the role of active land management in natural community restoration, maintenance, and the impacts on the animals and other plants that, the animals and plants all together. So what I really liked about a previous vision statement or motto, I can't remember what it is, but I'm never one much for jingles or anything, but Habitat for Life was one of those things for the division of FWC under which the wildlife and habitat management section falls. And I don't think they use it anymore, but I still think it's so applicable to FWC's work and the Nature Conservancy's work and just conservation organizations in general, because I feel like this simple 3-word statement just encompasses a lot of layers of meanings, right? It's habitat for life, like what life? It's plant life, it's longleaf pine, it's insects, it's even human beings. We don't have habitat. This isn't our habitat where we're necessarily finding our daily shelter, food, and mates, but it's like our mental health habitat for sure. And then also it's for life, like it's for all life, and that encompasses time too. So I just have always really liked that motto, and I think it really encompasses a lot of the work that I've done and that like my coworkers have done over the years. So let me then move on to the first community that I wanted to talk about, the work that's been done. This was an FWC property, not this picture, but the work that I'm going to describe to you is happened on an FWC property. But just in case you're not totally familiar with the wet prairie, this is a representative picture of one from the Florida Natural Areas Inventory Natural Community Guide from 2010. So, you know, pretty open, herbaceous, ground cover, fire adapted, just like the Sandhill, with just a few of the representative plants. Like I could have put probably 50 plants on there, but just some general ones. So where did we start at this wet prairie site that I'm going to show you over the next slides? This used to be a privately owned timber plantation, and this is an aerial image from 1994. So primarily the piece of land is going to be this kind of rectangular section north. This is a road. These are two roads. So the site, Wet Prairie Community, kind of extends down below this road to the south, but just focusing on this piece. So this timber company clear cut this land, and by 1994 anyway. The next earliest picture is from 85 when it was covered in timber. So I'm not sure exactly when the timber was harvested. That information of the timber sales and all of the past land use history was not made available to FWC when they acquired the property, despite them asking. So we can guess, but at 94 it was clear cut by then. But the state didn't buy it until 1998, and this 70 acres was part of a bigger 4,000 plus acre piece. And this photo is from 99. So unsurprisingly, since they didn't replant it, this site became extremely overgrown because they also weren't burning it. And in 2003, FNA, which is the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, which has had long-standing contracts with the state to evaluate public lands, natural communities, both current and historic. So their assessment in 2003 categorized this piece as historic wet prairie with a number of other acres on that in that same acquisition. So at that point, the land managers kind of knew what direction they were going to head if they had to if they wanted to try to bring back a wet prairie to this area. So now I'm just going to show you basically kind of a timeline with some photos showing the work that was done since 2003. And then sometimes I'm leaving up a bunch of these, the little time stamps here, but the yellow brackets will really be referring to what I'm talking about at the moment in case you get kind of bogged down. But I wanted to leave some of the dates up so you could keep a track of the history if you felt like it. So this area, as I said, is part of a bigger acquisition from the state or by the state. And this area's burn goals usually range between 10 and 15,000 acres a year at least. So when they burn here, and all these burns that I'm going to talk about, they're aerial ignition based burns. One, because of the large amount of acres that they're trying to burn every year. And so it's just trying to maximize the good burn days. There's also staffing issues, like how many people can you get to burn units? And then also from an ecological standpoint, there's enough roads and fragmentation of habitat anyway. So if we don't have to add in extra fire lines, we can use existing roads or waterways or wet places as fire breaks, then we wanted to try to do that. So by default, these burns tend to be large, and this unit is typically in maybe a 2,000 to 3,000 acre burn. So yes. This is in Franklin County, the Apalachicola River Wildlife and Environmental Area in Franklin County along Highway 65. So what they tried was an initial prescribed burn, but it was not very successful because of the dense shrubs and lack of fine fuels. So this is an image then from after that couple years, you know, it's still pretty densely vegetated. So they made the decision to use some mechanical treatment, which I know can be controversial at times because of the potential for ground cover disturbance and, you know, inappropriate perhaps timing of that event. But I think they decided that they didn't have another choice, and they didn't want to herbicide it. So they chose a gyro track and tested it out on 16 acres. So this is the habitat that they were looking at. And this is a man back here. If you can see that person is over 6 feet tall. So the shrubs were quite dense and quite tall. So this was the work that they did to test out this 16-acre piece and see what happened. So then this was in April or in September of 2006, they decided to burn it again. And then this is a picture from April of the following year in the spring. So they noticed that the burn was able to consume a bit more fuel marginally better in those mowed areas. And they saw some response from more typical prairie type plants, pitcher plants, sundews, meadow beauties. And here's an aerial image of the mowing, mowed strips, and then the rest of the site in the following April after that burn. So because of that, they decided to go ahead and mow the rest of it. So this is an aerial image from February of 2008, shortly after they finished using that machine to mow down the additional 61 acres. Now, during this time, like FWC was developing an objective-based vegetation monitoring protocol to help inform land managers by going out and sampling vegetation characteristics at these actively managed communities. But the protocol was still under development, and so even though it existed, it wasn't really super informative at that time. We did, another part of the agency decided to begin a herpetofauna study that went for a year. And this was conducted here at this site, another management area to the south, and also used ANF as a reference site to hopefully determine some reptile or amphibian species that could be classified as bioindicators of a more intact wet prairie system. So I'll share a little bit more about the results of that later. But it just was going on during this time between 2008 and 2009. They burned this site again in 2008. And I should say that in these mechanical treatments, they did not mulch the material, so it wasn't finely ground. They pretty much just knocked it over and left it on the ground to hopefully cure a bit so that it could be more available as fuel in a fire. When they burned it in 2008, they still were kind of vexed by the remaining mid-story shrubs that did not burn up. And then here's a picture of one of the arrays. This is just one arm. It's a drift fence study, so it's silt fence with funnel traps on the side, and you can see another one in the distance. Then, as I said, this is part of a larger tract of land that was industrial timberland. Even though this site had been clear cut, the remaining pieces around it were still densely timbered. And so, you know, a lot of work on state property that was timberland that, you know, maybe still has a lot of timber on it. The state does work to sell that, at least with FWC. It's not in the guise of profiting from the timber. It's just that we're not allowed to just grind up the trees. If it's a sellable item, then they're going to sell. It doesn't mean that the next round of planting will involve timber sales on these properties. It's just that if we're removing trees, let's sell the trees. So they thinned it around the edges here. And that did impact their decision on the next prescribed fire. So they decided to wait to burn the unit until April of 2013 to let the fine roots recover in those thinned areas so that fire wouldn't potentially go in and kind of add additional stress to trees that had already been subjected to that machinery around them. So they burned it in April of 2013, and it was still patchy due to the lack of fine fuels and too much tie. So they decided again in May of 2013 to roller chop it, using just single pass, not filling the drum with water. And here's the machine there, so you can still see the height of these shrubs. So that was in May. And then finally in March 2015, they burned it again, and we called it a success. And that was essentially because the fire carried across the landscape for the first time since they started this process, more than 12 years later. So here's a picture of that fire burning pretty solidly. Again, this was an aerial ignition, so that's done by helicopter if you're not familiar. And there's little balls that get dispensed from machines. There's an operator and another person in there spotting to decide how the fire is going and what to do next. And so those balls ignite, and when they hit the fuel, the fire catches on that fuel and spreads. So shortly after that, in the fall, we decided to do another herpetofauna study, and this time we wanted to see if we could detect any of the bioindicator species that they were trying to identify in the first study. So that was another year-long effort, which again, I'll go back to a little bit later. But here's what the place looked like a few months after that March burn. So a much better herbaceous response, some of the more typical wet prairie type species, like a big improvement from those super tall and dense shrubs. We actually have some like Rexia and Xyrus going crazy in there. And the pitcher plants, if you can see kind of in the background, are starting to show up. So I think everyone was pretty happy to see that at that time. By this time, FNA had refined, along with FWC, how they wanted to do some more of this objective-based vegetation monitoring. So in the fall, they came out, and when they do this monitoring, they're doing it across the whole area. And when you have a particular natural community type, they try to focus on 60 points randomly placed within all of the communities that are classified as such on that property. So, again, this was kind of their new version of the protocol. So they actually only had 27 points in the wet prairie site across this place and another couple places on this area. They only had 11 points in this particular location that year. And then their goal is to come back every 5 years and re-sample these community types. They work with the area manager and the heads of the objective-based vegetation monitoring program to come up with the best places to sample in that particular year. And then this is an aerial image showing this herp array, this drift fence array. And, we all kind of know how sensitive wet prairies can be to, traffic, human traffic. So you can see this is our trail. My coworker and I, walked this trail to this array, 6 times a month or so for a year. And, we realized we were making the trail, but we're like, okay, well, if you just stick to this trail, at least it'll just be one trail. So we didn't, you know, we did the best we could to reduce our impact. And then we burned this again in 2019. So here you can see more of the individual balls. They have ignited but not yet burned together, but then they will and create that kind of continuous flame. And then again, FNA came back and monitored the vegetation in 2020, 5 years later. This time they had a full 60 points across our wet prairie sites, and this time there were 37 in this unit. So a little bit more comprehensive. And if you've noticed, like, we've just been burning it since 2013. So, you know, we had 4 burns in a row. This is the third in April of 22 that we burned it. Again, here's kind of the where we've just lit and we're flying back, I think, to probably drop some more balls in the next transect, which is how we do it. And this was another good burn. Here's what it looked like the next day on the ground. And then we burned it 2 years later in March. And actually, this is what it looked like last October. So hopefully, if everything still goes to plan, this fall, FNA should be coming out again. And we've had 2 additional burns since the 2020 event. So I hope that they're still going to be following that schedule, but since I don't work there anymore, I'm not totally sure. But if they do, I'm totally going to be trying to get that report because I'm really curious to see what they find the next go around. Because if you walk out there, you know, yes, there are still shrubs and, you know, but they're not that tall. You know, you can walk out there and there may be where there's shrubs, there's waist high. So definitely not saying it's perfect, but I think from what it started back in the late 90s when the state got it, it's very different and hopefully moving forward in the right way. So I'm not sure why I can't go forward anymore. I don't know, Josh, you might have to help me with this. Okay, why does it do that? Okay, anyway, so here is the data table about wet prairies from the 2021 report that's resulted from the 2020 monitoring. So, you know, it's not showing anything that's too unusual here. 2020, the shrub stems were too dense, too tall, and overall made up too much cover in their sampling quadrats. But, you know, what we're talking about is the desired future condition. So, for instance, the shrub height, the maximum average height, they want it to be less than 2 feet. So, yes, we had more points than not within above the desired future condition, but we're also talking about they want it to be less than 2 feet. So it's not 6 feet anymore. Maybe most of them are not under 2 feet, but I think we're moving in the right direction because I don't think in 1998 you would find many shrubs at all under 2 feet tall in that landscape. Same thing with shrub cover. The cover percent, they want it to be less than 5. Well, clearly we have many more points percentage-wise beyond that have that sampling quadrat with shrub cover greater than 5%, but that's also a very low shrub cover. Still, I think that we're moving in the right direction just from the pictures you can see, and if you're walking out there, it's not totally covered by shrubs. And certainly the fire would not carry as well as it has the past few times without that cover of herbaceous cover. So the other interesting thing for me is the herbaceous cover in 2020. They said it was too low overall, but they're hoping to have points with more than 70% herbaceous. So again, like I said, I'll be very curious to see what they find from 2025 monitoring if they actually get out there and do it. So jumping back real quick to the herpetofauna studies. So real quick, like I said, in the first go around, they really wanted to determine bioindicator species for wet prairie habitat. And there's details about the survey protocol. In 2015 and 2016, we wanted to see if we could detect any of those bioindicators. What they found was that at ANF, the reference site, these species were only found at ANF. That's the mimic glass lizard, the coal skink, and the ornate chorus frog. So when we set this up pretty similarly to how they did it, we had one array instead of four, but we put our one array right in the middle of where they had their four. And we were able to find chorus frogs 3 times, 2 adults and 1, well, there was more than 1 tadpole, but we had tadpoles on 1 occasion in February. So we did not have that in 2008 and 2009. So we counted that as at least somewhat of a success, a movement in the correct direction for this ecosystem. And there it is. Now, I do not know, I didn't pay attention to whether this was the adult from November or December, but there he or she is. And you may notice in the background a plant, which happens to be the thick-leaved water willow. So that was another thing that I spent time on out there. I became kind of obsessed with finding rare and listed plants across this area when I worked there. And definitely, I'm pretty sure most of you know Ann Johnson. She did not quash that in me. She probably stimulated it more because I went out a few times with her looking for stuff and, you know, really learned a lot from her and appreciated her input. In fact, this was a wiregrass gentian that I found on that wet prairie in December of 2015. And, you know, it's not the best picture. I hope I've taken better pictures of wiregrass gentian since then, but it's the first one I found, the first one I ever saw. So more plant nostalgia, I guess. But anyway, I remember emailing her. I was like, is this what I think it is? And she was like, yes, it is. Where did you find it? You know? And so she and I spent time looking out there too for more plants. And between that 6-year period or so when I really had time and to go out there and look for things, we came up with 7 different listed species at that site in that time. You know, not just single plants here and there, you know, we would find a number of each one of these species. So anyway, it was just very kind of exciting and rewarding to be able to see, hey, not only does the structure of this place look good, but, you know, we're in plant wise, but we're also seeing like maybe some animal response too with those amphibians. Now, I don't know if anybody's going to do another reptile and amphibian study out there. I'm not really sure, but that would also be very interesting if they did. And I don't think anybody out there is really looking at plants right now, but at least we have some information about them. So surely the challenges for wet prairies, I kind of categorize them in 5 different ways. Fire, the long period of fire suppression, which can lead to extreme duff buildup and drains in the wet areas that were within them or around them, making that just challenging to introduce fire back, especially growing season fire when those bordering drains and wetlands may be drier than people like to burn under those conditions, because you have the tendency for things to potentially creep around and smolder in those drains. And then, of course, the fine fuel availability and continuity, especially in places like this place that had been clear cut and then ignored between the ownership when the timber company cut it and then sold it. But other places have other issues. There's plenty of wet prairie on this site that has a lot of timber on it. You know, of course, not the greatest place to plant timber, but timber companies do what they do. And then we're left with these very stunted trees in very wet areas that become very challenging to harvest without completely tearing up the ground, you know? So what are you going to do? Like, how are you going to get that done? Of course, competition from shrubs is a huge issue here because there is so much moisture, there is so much organic material in this soil. These shrubs just build up crazy root masses that can like cause them to resprout and grow crazily and outcompete anything. And then I mentioned the ground cover disturbance. You know, they had to very carefully pick when to use mechanical treatments, and not just willy-nilly sending machines out there, just trying to send them in when the fire wasn't working. Because of course, fire is the natural way these things would be maintained, but you know, clearly wasn't doing the job in this case at the beginning of this project. And then the hydrologic issues that face these sites. This prairie is kind of fortunate as to where it's located. It's located south of a large creek, and there isn't much anything blocking floodwaters from that creek. So when it overflows, when it floods, it can kind of naturally flow into the prairie. It's not really impeded by anything. So you've got more of a natural hydrologic regime there. But another prairie nearby has a railroad easement going along one side of it. And so what are you going to do? The railroad company owns that. They have their gravel, you know, kind of base building up to the tracks. It's a little more challenging to restore flow when you have that type of infrastructure all along one end, one side of it. And then scalability of this, you know, because of all these other factors, it can be challenging to try to do this at a large scale because you really have to stay on top of the vegetation maintenance, you know, through mowing or repeated burning, because if you don't, it's just going to get grown over so quickly in these types of habitats. So this is 70 acres, but as I said, on the rest of that site, there's identified over 2,500 acres of wet prairie. So, you know, how long would that take if people could even dedicate the sole amount of time just to that, not to mention all the other management activities and goals on these types of large properties. So essentially, I think from this, though, what will work, depending, is to try fire first and often, because that's the main thing that maintains the community type. And then carefully evaluate the pros and cons to mechanical treatment, and certainly be prepared for opportunities. You know, like we were fortunate to have timber contracts in place. It doesn't apply for this prairie, but in general, we had a long-term contract, you know, so that there was another place, another time, another story. But like we had a contract ready so that when we happen to have some dry conditions in one of these very, very wet areas that had vexed people for a long time, we were able to get in there and do some harvesting of that site, and with minimal ground disturbance. But it took years and just the right combination of factors to be able to take advantage of that. So anyway, that is pretty much all I have to say about the wet prairie. Yes, if you want to, yes. We can do that now. Well, I don't think anybody ever counted, right? Because that objective-based vegetation monitoring, take a guess. And I haven't been out there in a long time, but I would say I could probably, not being a botanist, but probably come up with 50. We did not bring anything in, so it was all there. Yeah, we did not plant anything. So I think there's I don't think it's much wiregrass out there. I think it's a lot of Rincospora. And trying to think what else would be, I think it's mostly that, the different species of that genus. Because they never felt like it was dry enough to harvest them without causing more damage. Without causing more damage to the ground cover, they felt it was not ever dry enough to harvest without rutting. So that's why they're left. They didn't just, they decided to leave them, and they decided that there weren't that many. I mean, there's definitely little clusters of trees towards the south and then patches in the north, but they just felt like cutting those down would be detrimental to the overall scene. Well, that, yes, but they were hoping that being able to regularly burn it would burn up those seedlings. And I have to say, like, going out there, you don't see a bunch of slash pine seedlings like you do in other places. Because that was certainly an issue we saw, like in some ephemeral wetland stuff that we were doing. Um, because it's more challenging even to burn those than this wet prairie. And so definitely had a lot of pine recruitment in those places, but not here. I mean, I'm not saying there's none, but you don't go out there and just see a baby pine trees either. Yes. Anybody else have any questions about wet prairie stuff before I go on to the dry end of things? And of course, you can ask questions later or contact me later. Two, so again, at the opposite end of this hydrologic spectrum, but very similar looking, Sandhill. And again, this is a picture from the FNA Natural Communities Guide. And now I'm going to go to the place where I work now, which I've been there about 2 years. I spent about 9 years at that other property before I came here. So you probably have heard of this place before. It's the Bluffs and Ravines Preserve that's about 45 minutes west of here. The main piece I'll be talking about is the southern piece, and that was purchased mostly in the early 80s. This northern piece up here was in the late 80s, early 90s. And this is pretty much a pure sandhill upland with the ravines kind of intersecting through or traveling, crossing over the preserve in various places, which you'll see in a minute, a better picture of that. This place is about 6,500 acres altogether, but with the other conservation properties around it, it's about 25,000 acres of conservation land total. There's Prairie over here, Beaver Dam Creek, water management property here, and a conservation easement of about 650 acres in between the two spots. So where this place started, in the 40s, I've got a series of aerial imagery of over time here to show you. This is the southern end of the preserve, and if you've ever hiked on the Garden of Eden Trail, for reference, it's right here in orange. These are the ravines, the dark blackish gray things here, and then the uplands are these lighter pieces. And I just left these red outlines of our management unit just to help us, kind of see where we're at on this landscape. Nothing unusual about the previous land use before TNC acquired the property. Pretty much subsistence stuff until the 40s, longleaf pine, heavily logged, but in a pre-industrial fashion. So some of the biological characteristics of the landscape were still intact. But then in the 50s, the St. Joe Company had ownership of a lot of this property, and so began clear cutting it. This southern piece here was owned by a different landowner, and that comes into play by the 60s with the resulting look of the place. This private landowner did not, or this other private landowner did not have as much money as St. Joe, so they couldn't afford to do all this windrowing that St. Joe did. So we have some places on the preserve that never experienced that type of treatment. but still, the places in between the windrows were planted with offsite pine slash and sand pine. Nothing earth-shocking or earth-shattering there happened everywhere around this area. But these unwindrowed areas, this other landowner provided good information to the Conservancy when they owned it or when they bought it, and began to think about restoring it because they could function as like reference sites, like this unit down here, as to what the landscape might have looked like, what kind of goals they were moving towards. And then the windrowed areas provided some initial source of ground cover seed, including wiregrass. And they definitely did most all of it. If you weren't aware, this is Summatoria State Park, but St. Joe pretty much and the other landowner pretty much windrowed the whole southern part of the preserve, along with lots of other land across this part of Florida. Early on, some of the restoration strategies, the staff of TNC knew that fire was going to be pretty important because this is a fire adapted landscape. So they wanted to bring that back. And this just an early number of acres that they did across repeated number of units for 6 years there early on. The other strategy that they wanted to do, or the other thing they wanted to do, was to bring back the plant community of that Sandhill. Those windrows, basically, after the trees have been harvested, they scrape up all of the remaining vegetation and pile it into rows. So in between the rows, you pretty much just have a scraped bare dirt thing that they could plant trees on. And they wanted to get rid of that whole scene and try to bring back continuous ground cover. So they knew they wanted to replant longleaf pine, and there was, and this, as I said, is going to be a little more general than what I was showing you for the wet prairie, because this is for the entire preserve, and also encompasses a lot more different techniques because people were really exploring how to do this at scale and learning a lot of things that were not known, which really kind of surprised me. I didn't realize how much was learned about wiregrass biology and management of it at ABRP during this time. One of the things that they tried initially with longleaf pine was bare root planting, and they quickly realized that was not the way to go because most likely due to the very poor soil quality. It's basically pure sand and drains water quite quickly. All those trees died, like literally all of them. So they switched to planting containerized trees, which are the tubulings that have dirt around them like you would buy a regular plant at your nursery. And then trying to determine what density to plant them at. Again, trying to find that good mix of survivorship without making the place look like a tree plantation, enough to hopefully generate some natural regeneration after fires too. Wiregrass, initially they did take some of the clumps that still remain in the windrows and transplanted them around. They had the idea that restoring some of the windrows themselves, because of the additional nutrients in those piles, might facilitate, good growth of wiregrass that would then spread across the landscape. But they didn't realize that wiregrass doesn't behave that way. It doesn't really spread. I heard somebody tell me recently that maybe in a 10-year period that one plant might spread 3 feet or meters. I can't remember which, but not very much. Not like what you would think a typical grass species would do. And of course, I think it was even known then that wiregrass was very sensitive to ground disturbance. So they did harvest some seed, and this is a picture of the wiregrass nursery, basically in its heyday when they could grow over 100,000 wiregrass plants. It's very successful. The plants look great. It takes a lot of work to do this. and maintain these plants, and then go out and plant the plants. So it's very effective, but then you end up with kind of wiregrass in rows, which you can see today on sites of the preserve. And also, it still doesn't spread that much, you know? So they wanted to look at ways of direct seeding the plant. And what they did was come up with a few different ways. A couple I've showed here. What was some leaf blower kind of devices that they used. So they would literally blow the seeds using air off the back of tractors onto a prepared landscape. They would clear the property, as you can see here. This type of land clearing works in the Sandhill because they don't have the shrub competition the way wetter sites do. So they're able to clear land like this without worrying too much about shrubs taking over the scene before wiregrass and the other herbaceous plants take hold. This is a picture of a flail vac, which is used to collect the wiregrass seed. They still use this method today. So they did learn that even though that leaf blowing method of direct seeding was not effective enough to replace, you know, say planting plugs at scale, because the contact of the seeds with the bare mineral soil was not enough. There was not enough interface between the seed and the dirt for successful germination. So they came up with another method, which I'll share with you in a minute. But then going back to the community itself, they wanted to try to do something with those windrows. And so there was a strategy of kind of flattening the windrows over a period of 20 years, in addition to planting some of those windrows with the plugs. So this map here kind of shows the windrow work that was done. Different colors represent different years, but they worked on a lot of the preserve to mitigate the effects of these windrows. But, you know, even a couple years ago, you can still see the effects today. And you can see them on the ground too. When you go out there and walk around, you'll go up and down hills that represent the windrows, which is kind of interesting to me too, coming from working at such a wet place where, you know, there they bed the rows in the wet places and plant the trees on the top. Here, they're shoving all the stuff together and planting the trees in between to limit competition. So this is today's strategy. After all that work that all those people did and all the testing and evaluating, what they've come up with and what we're using now, primarily offsite partners, because ABRP itself essentially became a test site for all these previous strategies. So by the time they developed the method that they favored, there wasn't much left to do at ABRP as a wholesale beginning to end operation. There are definitely places where we are filling in or going back and redoing things because the results didn't turn out the way that people had hoped. But how it works now at a new place, the land is cleared to look like this. It's pretty ugly, but it turns out to look pretty good at the end. And what we have is then burning seed donor sites that have been developed over the years. That would be for wiregrass collection and other native forbs. Meanwhile, the land is cleared towards the end of the growing season to prevent additional sprouting of undesirable plants. This seed is harvested using this machine called a flail vac. There's about a 3-week period in November when you can collect viable seed. And this is just a pile of, they can collect thousands of pounds. This past year, they collected 7,000 pounds of seed. And then this was all taken and planted at some of our restoration sites across the Panhandle, primarily the Eastern Panhandle. And then the machine that they found works best to plant this seed is a grasslander. So pulled behind a tractor, the seeds go in this hopper here. There's little tines that kind of just scratch the dirt, And then the seeds fall down, and then these flat tires kind of press the seed into the dirt, getting better contact with that soil for germination. Yes. Well, the seeds retain viability, and for at least a year or more. Especially, we store them in a cooler at the National Forest, any leftovers, because people make plans to do restoration work. You collect seed based on that request, but some things, sometimes it doesn't always work out, so we might have extra. And so we put it in the cooler. We did get all the seed tested for viability, sending it off to different labs. But typically the seeds collected in November, and it's being planted in December, January, February. And then right after that, we go ahead and have contractors put in longleaf pine at whatever density the particular landowner wants. Some places have really high tree density requests, others less. So like I said, we're primarily using this method off-site from ABRP, in particular at Torrey State Park, where the staff over the years has done this technique on about 4,000 acres. There's been some dense sandpine plantations with virtually no ground cover, just basically like almost pine straw farms that have been turned into, more open longleaf pine, wiregrass systems. And that northern tract of our property will also be going through this process. We kind of started it this past year, but we have a few hundred acres that we would like to do this for. And then, like I said, the Apalachicola Regional Stewardship Alliance, which is ARSA, that's a big group of agencies and nonprofits in this part of the Panhandle that work together to share resources, and we've helped them out a lot over the years. We all help each other, but in this particular process, TNC has provided a lot of support to people at other places to do this work. Of course, the other component is the wildlife part. So just a little bit of the brief work that has been done as part of the Sandhill restoration. It's not just about the plants. We have animals that are representative of this community too. Early on, we were fortunate to still have gopher tortoises despite the timbering operations. They did an initial survey in the 90s that found burrows were increasing significantly over that period, and I believe it was due to the restoration work. That number continues to grow. We don't do official tortoise surveys. This is just an example of some work that we did a year and a half ago, looking for tortoise burrows to help us inform some of our other work with indigo snakes. So, we have a lot of active burrows. This is just a small amount of one survey that we did. And so, again, we're at least doing something right. We still have tortoises. We have more tortoises than before. And then because of all of our tortoise burrow densities and numbers, and then the habitat itself, the Sandhill ecosystem with the ravines, we were able to become a release site for the eastern indigo snake in 2017. So we're still working to make sure the habitat is appropriate for them by regularly burning the site. That's our main maintenance technique at the Bluffs and Ravines. We do occasionally treat hardwoods if they seem to be sprouting up, if we didn't have a great fire one year, or if they're getting to be a little bit too dense, then we might cut some down or selectively herbicide them. But for the most part, fire is our main management tool at the preserve. We've released 167 snakes, and so far the Fish and Wildlife Service wants to put 300 on the landscape, but really the goal is to have a self-sustaining population return to this area, because really the last time there were wild individuals even observed at the site was in the mid-'80s. But good news for us, we found 2 juveniles that were born on the preserve in the fall of 2023. So that was definitely really exciting after all the work that people put in. Not me, because I'd only been there at that point, like, you know, a year and a half. So no, 6 months. Sorry, I'm getting my time mixed up. But I'd only been there 6 months. So I felt kind of guilty when they're like, oh, baby indigo. And I'm like, yes, but I've done nothing to contribute to it being here, but it was still exciting. So we found these 2 juveniles, and what was even cooler is that they were 2 miles apart. So they've done genetic work on all the snakes that have been released. All of those snakes that were released were born in captivity. So we have data on all of them. And so I'm not sure if they've been able to determine the parentage of these. That's beyond my role. But maybe we'll be able to figure out which particular snakes were the parents of these individuals, but we at least feel pretty confident that they were at least 2 separate clutches because they were found so far apart. So, you know, the snakes, indigo snakes, can get up to 8 feet. I should have put a picture on here, but I didn't think of it till now, of the one that we caught a couple months ago that was 6 feet long. But these guys were clearly only 2 feet long or so. So definitely young snakes, not pit tagged. So we knew they were, we knew they were born on the preserve anyway, but very cool. They were about 3 to 4 months old when we found them. So again, not perfect, but from what it was to what it is now, I think that the Conservancy can be proud of what they've done, just like FWC can be proud of what they did with that wet prairie. And, you know, everyone is still learning too, and there's more things to discover about how to manage these places more efficiently, more effectively, more appropriately. The challenges for the sandhills for sure are the lack of fine fuel pyrogenic ground cover, same as with the wet prairie. In this case, the competition is more from hardwoods like turkey oaks, but it's still not at the scale, I don't think, as the wet prairie, because you can get rid of them much more easily, it seems. Ground cover, the restoration being efficient at scale. I think that TNC has done a pretty good job of this. You know, the crew there have done thousands of acres of work over the years, but it still took them time to figure out how to get that done. And on the longleaf pine, survivorship is definitely patchy in places because of that, the poor nutrients and the permeability of the soil. This is a picture of something I was going to tell you a little bit about what we're kind of looking at right now going forward. We burned this area last February, and a few years before that, staff had planted some actual pine seeds to see what would happen. This happened to be an area, one of those earlier areas of work where the restoration didn't go as well as they had hoped. And so the pine tree survivorship here is very low. It almost looks like a wet prairie. There's so few trees out there. So somebody had gone, and previous folks had gone out and planted seeds of pine, and nobody thought they'd lived. They thought none of them had sprouted. They were all dead. We were actually going to go back in and plant containerized trees a couple months, a month after this was, no, actually a couple weeks after this burn happened. But when the crew were out there, they started seeing these little pine tree seedlings popping up through the now open landscape. And so we were like, hey, these things actually lived. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I think what the lessons are, that kind of the main takeaways for this type of sandhill, you know, eliminate competition via mechanical treatment. That's good. Direct seeding of native ground cover, and we follow that immediately by planting pines. So essentially, as soon as the tractors are done planting the seeds, the tree contractors come in and plant the trees. So it's all done at once. And Then, of course, frequent growing season fire. Like we pretty much don't even start burning at ABRP until late March, but really focus on the April to June timeframe, in particular to get the viable wiregrass seed. So last thing, once we discovered those little pine tree seedlings, I set up some survivorship plots in this 25-acre block, and went about counting how many seedlings I could find that were alive and that were dead, and then that were kind of within shade or a shadow, or not. Obviously, there's no shade out there now, but if they happen to be within the footprint of a shrub skeleton, as I like to call them, you know, the burnt up sticks that still remain after a fire with all the leaves gone, we would mark that down. So this is a picture of one of the plots. This red line kind of roughly outlines, I think it's about 1/100th of an acre, like maybe 12-ish foot radius circle here. And all the flags represent a pine seedling that was found. And I believe the orange ones here are live seedlings and the yellow greenish flags are dead. And you can kind of see, like, here's a bunch of shrub skeletons, and that's where pretty much all of the seedlings were found in this particular plot. Now, I haven't analyzed all of this data yet, but I may include something about our LiDAR data to, you know, say something about slope, potentially where we might have different survivorship or proximity to an old windrow. I haven't totally decided if I have enough data to do that yet. But anyway, this is kind of where we're going with it. Is what about the idea of combining planting native seeds, the native ground cover seeds at the same time as planting pine trees with seeds instead of plants. Because one, it would make the process go faster. And two, maybe there's better survivorship of seeds compared to seedlings in some of these sites where we've had challenges. Why, or if that's true, why that might be, or if that's true, don't know. But that's kind of our area of active inquiry right now. And I think that's about it. I think that's enough. Talked a lot. So, yeah. And I didn't say it, but of course, I could have listed everybody's agency or nonprofit symbol on here, but pretty much anyone, any agency you can think of in the Panhandle or nonprofit, they've had a hand in this, you know, in both projects. You know, so this, again, a lot of this, especially at TNC, I had nothing to do with. But I'm proud to be part of it now. It's a really fun place to work. And I certainly enjoyed all my work at FWC too. So it certainly wasn't all me. And there's a lot of other people to